So thanks for joining tonight. Tonight we're talking about racism and civil rights, historical perspective. We are lucky to have Professor David Kalivas, Ph.D., currently served as Senior Adjunct Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. Racism, a historical perspective. The United States has reached a critical time as civil unrest and mass protest against racist policies become more frequent across the country. The increased discontent and polarization has no clear resolution in sight and continues to challenge and weaken the bonds of our communities. Unfortunately, racism and the struggle for civil rights and equity is not new to the American perspective. To help us understand how we arrived at this point, the professor will offer a reflection on the history of racism and civil rights in the United States. He has asked me to keep the questions till the end. So if you can, please do that. He will start off by asking us questions, and I will turn things over to Professor David Kalivas as we speak. Thank you.
Sure. Everyone has trouble with Greek names, Dana, so that's fine. It's Kalivas, but that's okay. I've been called many things. I can't even begin to tell you. So Kalivas is great. But anyway, it's Kalivas. Thank you for hosting me tonight, and welcome to Celine and Cindy. I thought before I begin the presentation, I thought I'd just ask you now. If it were a big group, I would wait for all questions to the end, but it's a very intimate group. There's four of us. So if you had any questions that you wanted to ask now, you could unmute and just ask the questions, and I'll either put them in my head or jot them down and try and answer them quickly or integrate them into what I'm about to say over the next half hour or so. So did anyone have any questions they wanted to ask now? Because if so, now's the time.
I have a question. This
Yes.
is Dana. And it may sound obtuse, but I really do scratch my head about this. Is I truly don't understand how the color of someone's skin allows somebody to have a reaction that leads to racism. I don't understand the connection. So.
Well, you're in luck. That's the first thing that I'm going to deal with in my opening section. So yeah, so all right, that's a good one. All right, then. There's something in the chat, it looks like. Hold on. Not at this point. All right, that's great. All right, then, let's begin. I'm going to share the screen, and hopefully there we go. And you can, Dana, tell me, is that sharing properly?
Yes, it is.
All right, that's great. All right, here we go. So it's important for us to have some context on racism and civil rights and the history of race in that context too, and how ideas about race have changed. So tonight I'm going to try and provide some context, and I'm really going to attempt to do, okay, hold on. There we go. Something is wrong here, of course. We're going the wrong way. Okay, I don't know what's going on here. You know, it worked fine when we were doing this before. Okay, hold on.
If you go back to the slideshow and say start from the beginning, but that's fine too. Okay.
There we go. All right, so let's begin with some context. And I wanted to share some sources right up front. And I'll send this as a PDF to Dana, and if anyone's interested, she can email it out. It's always important to have information at our fingertips. And these are just some really powerful sources. And if you had print screen, you could even print them and save them. But, you know, Jean Theoharis is an author that's done a lot of writing on the history of civil rights. And that's the first book. James Baldwin, in terms of the literature, African-American literature, but also simply American literature. Baldwin is just great. And he's often an I should say undervalued and underread figure in 20th century American literature, but also Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, a very powerful piece. And on the left bottom, the Frederick Douglass book by David Blight. And in any event, these books are really important to get a context for the history of racism and the history of civil rights. I won't, spend time on each of them to talk about them because that would take up the whole 45 minutes. But I think it's just important to share them with you And I will send that out and to have a look that they're very powerful pieces here. Isabel Wilkerson, another great author who's written some powerful works, The Warmth of Other Suns, and Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents in the United States, really looking at the history of racism. So if you really want a powerful primary media source that's obviously dated in terms of, you could say, when it was done, the eyes on the prize, still nonetheless extremely powerful because it has so many primary media sources of the day. So I highly recommend Eyes on the Prize, both the first part and the second part that was done for PBS years ago. So I'd like to begin with this quote from James Baldwin. History does not refer merely to the past. History is literally in all that we do. Think about that for a moment. History is not simply the past. It's literally in everything that we do, Baldwin tells us. And oftentimes we don't appreciate the role of the past in shaping who we are and the need for us to look to the past to understand how, not only how we got here, both in terms of the wonders and the great things, but also in terms of the miseries and the problems, how they came to be, and how the solutions can be in understanding how they came to be. Because oftentimes, if we don't understand the whole context, then how are we going to resolve the problems? How do we search for solutions? And I think that the issue of racism and civil rights in this country is obviously an important one. It's one that's unresolved. And we may think, oh, it's all been resolved. Well, over the last 10 or so years, with the different protests, the different killings, the history that we've had in the past, I would say 15 to 20 years of the cases of police brutality and the responses to the deaths of African Americans in custody or in being pursued or being arrested or being harassed. And what's erupted, whether it's Ferguson and Baltimore, the whole list of them over the past decade or so tells us that a problem continues in our society. And I think the problem stems in many ways to an inability for us to understand that if we're going to focus on resolving these issues in the present, how did we get here? And so I think that, you know, the question that Dana presented at the very beginning, why is it that a person's skin color elicits such a strong reaction, racism? What is it with that? And I think we need to look to the Atlantic slave trade and the influence that the Atlantic slave trade had on our culture over time and continues to have as a beginning point. Now, you may say the Atlantic slave trade, well, that's all done. It's in the past. There's no slavery anymore. We've moved on, or have we? Think about this. For 404 years, slavery and the slave trade dominated in many ways Western culture and society. And in the United States, slavery existed in the United States for 158 years. Something that has been around for that period of time is bound to have an influence on society and culture. We often think about the history of the West as it becomes globalized with Columbus in 1492, you know, the ditty of sailing the ocean blue. But with Columbus and the others, you know, Vasco da Gama, Bartolome Diaz, and just a host of other folks that we always refer to as discoverers in the age of discovery, when in reality, Columbus represented the expansion of the Western European powers of the day of the 15th century, their expansion into the globe as they sought new ways to get to the Spice Islands, to get to China, to get to the sources of wealth that Asia represented. They were doing so not just for exploration, they were doing so to expand the Spanish, the British, the French, and other European empires and expand their interests. And in expanding, they stretched into the Americas, of course, and as they did so, the Americas became what we like to say colonized, conquered by the Europeans, and all the indigenous native systems fell under the expansion of the European powers. And one of the first things they began to do very early on in the 16th century is establish a slave culture and a society. And they began to establish a slave trade out of West Africa. And these statistics here show you how it became a normal business practice. And you can see this is the transatlantic exports. This is the transatlantic imports. And I underline this on purpose because the language of trading in human beings became a normal business practice and a normal part of Western culture, not only in Europe, but complete Western culture in the Americas as well, that became the colonies and then the independent states later on. As they, declared independence from the colonial powers in the 18th and early 19th centuries. But during this time, slavery was a predominant part of what was going on in the West. And this just gives you a sense of the numbers out of Western Africa. This is a conservative estimate of about 10+ million people that were stolen from their worlds, their homes in West Africa, and brought over into the New World. And this shows you, of course, where they went. The majority of the slaves, of these human beings from West Africa who were enslaved, the majority of them, of course, went into Central and South America. The smallest percentage of them came into British North America and what would become the United States. However, this is a conservative number, by the way. The most expansive numbers of slaves go as high as 15 to 18 million, some even higher. It's hard for us to know exactly. While the records that were kept were meticulous, because of course, as they're trading in human souls and human beings, they're also insuring their cargo, aren't they? They're also making sure that they have a track of how much they're spending, how much they're getting on the return for their investments in slave trading. And what's not included are all those killed during the transit period. And what's important to understand, to answer Dana's question quickly, what's really important to understand is that in the ancient world, in the world prior to this period of the 15th century and 16th centuries, notions of slaves being biologically inferior did not exist. Think about that. When we think of the ancient world, there has been slavery since time immemorial. The earliest human civilizations, maybe even before, had slaves. No question about it. From the, going into the ancient world, you can find always slaves. The Romans, the Greeks, and then even much before them, the Persians, all the way back to the Sumerians and the Egyptians, there has been slavery with us. The big issue here, however, is that there's no indication that slaves prior to this era of the Atlantic slave trade, there's no indication that slaves were seen as subhumans, that slaves were seen as an inferior part of the human species. They were certainly ethnocentric viewpoints. The Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Persians, whoever you like to pick for your civilization in the ancient world, they certainly saw their slaves as being perhaps culturally inferior. There was an ethnocentric view that you're the slave, we're not, if I can put this in general terms. But never was that based on biology. It was based on culture. But let's not forget that when you were a slave in the ancient world, you were a slave because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you were usually a slave because your people lost the battle or lost a war. And the consequences of losing a war was enslavement. And you could also buy your way out of slavery at different times. And of course, in the Roman world, many of the slaves were used to teach their children as tutors, many of the Greek slaves, for instance, and others. So slavery was not seen as anything to do with biological inferior status. And of course, in the Mediterranean world, there are multiple colors all the time. The Mediterranean world of the ancient world included Africans and all sorts of Mediterranean peoples. And so there was a larger integration of, for lack of a better way to put it, multicultural, multicolored realities. And at no point were the slaves seen as inferior in the same way as would happen after the Atlantic slave trade period. And we can deal with this more as we move forward, but that's a big distinction. The color line for slavery and the color line for determining one's status as a human being emerges in this period of the Atlantic slave trade. It didn't exist before. So this brings us to what the United States, I'm going to move along quickly, obviously we'll never get through everything tonight, but this brings us to an important a moment in time for the United States. The United States, comes out of this history of this 400 plus years of the slave trade, this period when the slave trade had become a norm in culture and business, that there was nothing unusual to see people walking in the local towns and cities with their slaves. It was just a normal part of society. And when the United States becomes an independent country, it is a slave society. We often don't think of it in this context. We often think, the United States becomes independent. We have Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Of course, there's the War of Revolution, the Declaration. There is then, the Constitutional Convention. Madison and the rest are all doing their noble things, creating the new society with the new Constitution and with the new experiment in democracy. Well, we know that experiment in democracy was only for the male propertied elite at the beginning. And later the franchise would be expanded, of course, but only to males. So the democracy was for the few at the very beginning. It excluded women. Women wouldn't get the right to vote until the early 20th century. So we already know that the apple pie version of the founding of the United States needed to be contextualized, and it just wasn't as hunky-dory as we all like to think. It was also a slave society, and we don't like to think of it like this, but the U.S. absolutely was. I mean, this is Mount Vernon, and I start with this. This is George Washington's plantation, and we don't like to think about Mount Vernon in Virginia as a slave plantation. Well, then you have to visit the place. It's marvelous, by the way. But when you visit it and you realize that George and Martha Washington were amongst, at one point, the largest landowners in Virginia, and at the bottom you can see the slave quarters, where they were multiple bunked slave quarters. It was run with hundreds of slaves. The only way to run the plantation was to do so with slavery. So we often don't like to think about us as a slave society, the United States, but it was. And again, Monticello, this is Jefferson's really marvelous home and plantation in Charlottesville, Virginia. I've been here 3 times. You have to go. However, it was a slave plantation. And at the bottom, you see the cabins, and there was a row of cabins where the slaves would live. And the only way they could operate these plantations, because they were there to earn income, was with slave labor, and that's how they operated them. So even at the founding, our founding fathers, most of them, of course, early on were Virginians, and they were very comfortable, like everyone else in society, with slaves. Now, this slide is gruesome on the bottom left. Let me just say, this is moving along, and this is called the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. So the entire southern part of the United States, as it would emerge, of course, was agricultural. And while the plantation system wasn't the only way to produce agricultural products, it was a major part of the economy. And the Whitney Plantation is now it's called a slave museum. It was a productive plantation, but in 1811 there was a huge uprising of slaves, and you see these are a ceramic artistic reproduction on the left of what, once the slave uprising was crushed, the heads of the unfortunate rebellious slaves were decapitated and put on pikes. So we often think of slavery sometimes in bucolic ways, they're picking cotton, and that they perhaps didn't rebel. But insurrections, there's this myth of the docile slave. Insurrections happened quite frequently, and they usually were crushed severely to prevent, the hope was, other slaves from rebelling. So we need right away to realize, number one, the United States was founded as a slave society. The slaves were brutalized, and even though, remember, the brutalization of slaves starts very early with the slave trade. They're packed into their ships. This dehumanization process begins when the slaves are exported. They're stolen from West Africa, brought to the New World. You see these pictures of the slaves laying down in their, for the 3-month journey across the Atlantic, and they're chained and lying down right next to each other, and in their own waste. And then at period once a day, they'd be brought up, things would be cleaned up and brought down. It was really the beginning of this dehumanization process. And I say this, that what we don't realize is that these human beings, these poor souls who were enslaved in the millions and transported to the New World, at different times, for different reasons, they would be thrown overboard. At different times, sometimes perhaps they were running out of food. Sometimes perhaps there was a sickness, and instead of treating people, you'd throw them overboard. So to preserve your cargo, they were seen as cargo. So for 4 centuries, you have this brutal, if you would, culture of slavery, creating a norm in society. When slaves arrived in the New World, they were branded by their owners once they were auctioned off. Again, these weren't humans like everyone else. They were slaves. And over 4 centuries, anyone who was dark, anyone whose skin color was not Caucasian, became associated with inferiority. And it's a process that develops over time. And this just to give you a sense of, some of the brutal treatments of the slaves. Now, U.S. is a slave society, but the slave trade was abolished in 1808. In fact, Thomas Jefferson promoted the legislation, signed the abolition of the slave trade into law. So was this a humane policy, or was this trade protectionism? Because what was happening here, of course, is that many of these significant plantations in Virginia in particular were also the best ways to refer to them as breeding farms. There was also an internal slave trade that was developing. And so if you have slaves coming from the Atlantic slave trade from West Africa, and they're competing with the internal slave trade from the plantations that found it profitable, of course, to trade in human souls within the U.S., then this was also a form of protectionism in 1808. It wasn't simply humane policy. It allowed the internal slave trade to continue. And from 1808 until the Civil War, the internal slave trade and the breeding, if you would, farms that took place on many plantations, again, further developed this notion that these people are like cattle. We own them. We breed them and we sell them. So not only were they being worked in various ways, shapes, and form on the plantations and on small farms as well, but and then they were being used as house servants as well, nannies, and a whole sort of whatever the masters wanted to do. But slave breeding in the internal slave trade did continue, and of course, the more slaves that the southern colonies and the southern states had, the more representation in Congress. We'll get to that in a moment. So keep this in mind for a moment. This is, of course, an auction house in Richmond, Virginia. And so this was the norm. It's Saturday, you're going to go to, or it's Wednesday, whatever the day may have been. The auctioning is taking place in Richmond, in Annapolis, in Charleston, in Savannah, any host of the cities. And of course, the ships that were being built and the products that were being built and produced, a lot of the cloth, for instance, that was sold back into the agricultural South and into the slave plantations came from the North. So as the North was industrializing, A lot of the slave ships were built, of course, in the New England ports. A lot of the cloth that was later used and the salted fish that was would be exported from the north down into the south. So the North, of course, was complicit in all of this, as well as the cotton that came from the South came to the mills in Lowell, for instance, with all the mills in Lowell. Where do you think the cotton came from? It came from slave plantations. So it was a shared responsibility, if you would, or a shared crime against humanity, if you want to call that, in a slave society. In that day and age of the early 19th century and 18th century, it was a part of a norm, unfortunately. And we'll see how the norm would change. Now, keep in mind, this is just a bill of sale, what do you call, not a bill of sale. This is just auctioning off slaves. The date, if you look at the left-hand corner, is 1823. So this is well after the 1808 abolition of the slave trade. The slave trade, the internal slave trade, this is one of 1835, kept going. And by the time we get to the Civil War, the slave population was estimated to be 4+ million. So just keep that in mind. And I've already touched on this, that it was a north-south symbiosis, if you would, a symbiotic relationship that the North also produced and was complicit in the slave economy. And as we get to the United States, in the Constitution, there's a 3/5 clause. And so the more slaves, of course, that were in existence in the southern states, that tended to be more rural. Of course, everything was rural, but the cities began to emerge at first in the north in the 19th century as the Industrial Revolution began to develop. But the 3/5 clause in the Constitution put in the Constitution. So the slave society, of course, was recognized as essential in the writing of the Constitution. The 3/5 clause increased the political power of slaveholding states in the United States. The 3/5 clause said, and you can read it here, any person not free would be counted as 3/5 of a free individual for the purposes of determining congressional representation. So there was a political dimension, but there was also an indication that these were 3/5 of a human being. So, and again, very different from the slavery of the ancient world. But by the 18th century, as the abolitionist movement emerges, not everyone thought it was normal. So there's an abolitionist movement in the 18th century in Britain, and as well as in the United States, that begins the struggle for human rights, that identified slavery as immoral and a crime against humanity. So just keep that in mind. Not everyone thought it was normal. Let me move it along because I'm realizing it's getting late. But eventually, things come to a head. And we have the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. And I'm not going to get into all of what the Civil War and the Reconstruction is, but from 1861 with the Civil War until its conclusion in 65, and then all the way until 1877 with the Reconstruction, this is a period in U.S. history that is fraught. It's a minefield. It's fraught with all kinds of misunderstandings if we don't teach about them as they should be taught. And what I mean by should be taught, do we teach about the past in the way we want it to be taught, in the way we want the past to have been, or do we teach about the past the way it was? This is a big issue, it seems increasingly, because if we look at the Civil War, one of the things that will emerge is that for many, and it's called the lost cause narrative that I put at the bottom, that really doesn't really emerge to the 1880s and 1890s, but you will often hear many say that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, that the southern states wanted to set up their own economies, to establish their own laws without interference from the federal government, that there needed to be a protection. This is the lost cause narrative that will emerge in the 1880s and 90s, that somehow the notion is that the Civil War was about the southern states' rights to control their own destinies, to legislate without being interfered by the federal government, and to essentially maintain their own culture and heritage, that their mission was a noble one, to maintain Southern heritage, and that it was being infringed upon by the Northerners and the Northern commercial industrial interests that were contradictory to the interests of the South. Okay. This doesn't make sense to me when you look at the history, because when we hear anyone say it was about states' rights and Southern heritage in the nobility of that Southern way of life, if that's what it was about, then there probably wouldn't have been a war. But what does it mean? And this is a powerful myth, the myth of states' rights as a cause for the Civil War, not slavery. Well, let's take a look at one example of South Carolina's Declaration of Succession. Because if we look at the declarations of succession for all the Southern states, we will see very clearly that when states' rights is proffered as the reason, what is meant is the right to own slaves, the right to trade slaves, the right to keep human beings in bondage, the right to keep human beings living a way of life at the whim of their masters, the right of the landowning classes to breed human beings like cattle for profit, the right to brutalize human beings for profit and for maintaining a way of life. That's what's meant by states' rights. So states' rights and Southern heritage as a reason for the Civil War is a powerful myth. And when we look at all of the declarations of succession from Virginia on down, Virginia, South Carolina, and we're picking South Carolina, of course, that's, Charleston and the firing upon Fort Sumter, when South Carolina fires on Fort Sumter, begins the Civil War. And the language of its declaration of succession is common amongst all of them. Let's have a quick look. This is from the South Carolina Declaration of Succession. Evidence is a nasty thing, isn't it? Because evidence will, it's nasty for those who like to perpetuate dangerous mythologies, because the truth can be found in the evidence. And here's the evidence. The South Carolina Declaration of Succession says, those states assume the right, and by those states, the reference is to the North. Those states assume the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions, meaning slavery, and have denied the rights of property established in 15 of the states, the Southern states, and recognized by the Constitution. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. They have permitted an open establishment among them of societies whose avowed interest is to disturb the peace and to elloign the property of the citizens of other states. Elloign, the old word for remove. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. Fancy language for the North they want to end slavery, and they want everything to end that we depend upon, and we don't like it. And so we're succeeding, and we're going to maintain slavery. If that's not a reason for leaving the Union, if that doesn't tell us that slavery is the reason, and I don't know what does. Here is the Constitution of the Confederacy, article of that Confederacy. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and shall have the right of transit and sojourn in any state of this Confederacy with their slaves and other property, and the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. So it was very much about slavery. And of course, this was part of an era in the 19th century where the Europeans were expanding into the world as well, and where the culture in the rest, really in the West, became really central in that culture was racism. It was normal. It became called scientific racism by the mid to late 19th century. And so what was happening in the U.S. What wasn't isolated. The Western world, as it began to conquer most of the globe in the 19th century, did so based on this notion that there are inequality of human races, and that the Europeans, and by extension the United States, the West, the white Westerners, were at the top of the food chain. They were the dominant species, and all others were inferior. Of course, this is where Adolf Hitler comes from. Hitler's ideas about the superior race didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of the history of the West, starting in the 15th all the way into the early 20th centuries. Keep that in mind, because I want to just give this little global context. The U.S. wasn't alone here. But after the Civil War and after the Reconstruction era, while the federal troops were in the southern states, Black office holders became very predominant. If you look during the Reconstruction period, again, go through this a bit quickly, but there were hundreds of representatives, essentially, that would be elected to state office and federal offices in the period of Reconstruction. Now, after Reconstruction, between 1877 and roughly 1900, and I have here 1877 to 1965, the United States would be segregated. Reconstruction would end. The southern states would come back into the fold. The sort of the white supremacist classes that had been dominant in the southern state would become dominant once again. And by the 1890s, the African Americans who had, achieved lots of success in electoral, state and local and federal positions, became mostly barred from those positions as ordinances and as dispossession of their ability, if you would, to own property in some states, as ordinances were put into place to prevent them from voting, and then, of course, white terrorism. The Ku Klux Klan became more and more a norm, and both extra-legal and legal violence against African Americans would essentially begin to see this process. I put apartheid, which is, we used to think of apartheid in South Africa, but apartheid was the central sort of characterization that we can use to understand Jim Crow America, or a segregated United States. And by the time we get to 1896, there's a Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, where the separate but equal doctrine was established. And so by 1896, what in fact had emerged on the ground, where African Americans were essentially put in their place again by a resurgence of white dominance, and in conjunction with white terrorism, became law in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. And essentially from the 1880s and 90s right into the 20th century, there would be over 250 incidences of African American communities being massacred, nearly wiped out, and harassed. There would be thousands of lynchings to make sure African Americans in the South, but also in the North at different points, as we'll see, are in their place and understand their place. These are two big ones: the Wilmington Massacre of 1898 and the Tulsa Massacre, Tulsa, Oklahoma Massacre of 1921, often referred to as the Greenwood Massacre. We can maybe discuss this a little bit in the question and answer period of the Tulsa Massacre, which was wiped out of the memory of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and only in the 1990s was a commission put in place to study and to once again investigate the Tulsa Massacre and try and understand and essentially try to create reparations to compensate the thousands of African Americans over a 35 city block area in Tulsa that was wiped out. You see on the right-hand side the picture, virtually wiped out in the massacre. This became a norm in the early 20th century. Lynchings and violence against African Americans. Again, you look the wrong way at someone, the KKK or some form of the American Protection League, some form of extra legal measures from the sheriff's office or the law enforcement even in different communities. And before you know it, there's a lynching. And it would be a huge spectacle with children and families. It became a horrible part of the United States. Now, from 1915 to 1970, there's something called the Great Migration, where the segregated South and the conditions in the South of tenant farming, where essentially many of your freed African Americans were finding themselves in a generational struggle of poverty as tenant farmers, and African Americans began to migrate out of the southern states into the northern states during this period. Now, Isabel Wilkerson has a great book on this, The Warmth of Other Suns. If you ever get a chance, you really should read it. But between 1915 and 1970, there's this great migration of African Americans from the southern states into the Midwest and into the northern states. Now, what were they going to find? They didn't find paradise. They found, in many instances, the similar kinds, but a much more hidden sometimes, racism and segregation in those northern states as well. But to travel in a segregated country was dangerous. And so you might have seen the movie, The Green Book. I actually didn't see the movie, but there were not just one, there were multiple green books, they were often called. The Negro Motorist Green Book, this one's from 1936, and it says it's the 1940 edition. They were sometimes handwritten, sometimes they were also, of course, published, and sometimes they went out of date because someone's business would close or someone's boarding house would close. They were a way for African Americans not to find themselves in a town as they were traveling that was not welcoming them, that could do them harm. And so this is a really important part of, in the United States, what we don't realize, a testimony to the history of racism in this country. Even to travel, you needed to make sure you could travel safely. And this, of course, emerges amongst the African American communities as a network of travel guides to help people along their way. Because if you found yourself in a community after dark and you're trying to maybe get a room or have something to eat at a diner or something, and of course there would be signs at times to tell you whites only, but many communities, particularly in the North and in the Midwest and West, because in the South it was known, it was very clear, whites only, and where African Americans shouldn't be. Not so clear. So Sundown Towns, this book by James Lewin, very powerful work, became a part of U.S. culture. Now, the sundown towns, some of these places actually have signs that would very, very outright, white tenants in our community only. In the 20th century, right into the 60s, became very, very clear. Coloreds only, white ladies only. We cater to white trade only. In this area here, this is the Negro area. Colored waiting room. And this one on the left, of course, true story, Hitler's love life revealed. So in the 30s here, and of course, the Nazis, in many instances, were modeling a lot of their actually legislation in the 30s on the legislation of the segregation legislation in the United States. Really an interesting and warped turn of events on that one. But this segregated society in the US, if not a clear indication of the racism that was a norm. In fact, to look at race. This is the famous or infamous KKK march on Washington in 1925, where no one's faces were covered. Members of Congress and Senate, judges, members of the elite, openly marching. I mean, we know that in Groton, Massachusetts, in the early 20s, Groton, Massachusetts, of course, it's speculation that it was a sundown town. It's been difficult to find any. There were no ordinances, but it was a center in the 20s of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. And in the 20s, of course, there was this resurgence of the Klan, and communities would not be welcoming to African Americans. And African Americans would not want to be in communities, of course, where the Klan was dominant. And so these sundown towns, congregations of the Klan, commonplace, not simply in the South, in the northern and western and midwestern states as well. And a lot of the work of this person, Ida B. Wells, one of the founders of the NAACP, early civil rights leader, she did a lot of studies, particularly on the lynching laws in Georgia, and really heralded a lot of work on the lynchings, on the thousands of people who were lynched. So by the early 20th century, African Americans are organizing. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909, is in response to all this persecution and violence against African Americans. We get to the World War periods, of course, where there are segregated military units. When we get to the early 50s, after the war, when many, of course, African Americans are coming back from fighting in World War II against fascism and Nazism and the white supremacy that it represented, they're coming back here in segregated military units. It's during the Truman administration where that finally is ended. But by the early 50s, the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, ends official apartheid. It overturns Plessy. So it's in 54 that we begin to see the end to legal segregation in the United States. It continues, in fact, of course, on the ground, but legally it begins to end. And that gives way, of course, for the emergence of the, of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, when we think of Martin Luther King Jr. And the entire civil rights movement. We think of Martin Luther King, of course, and his very famous speech in Washington in 1963, the I Have a Dream speech. But what we often don't realize, that without the civil rights movement of the African Americans and really, and everyone who thinks that segregation is evil, organizing and joining the civil rights movement, that the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Acts of 1964 and 65 are the first time that African Americans are going to have their rights codified and protected. Now, when we think of the civil rights movement in the United States, the two figures that come to mind, of course, is Dr. Martin Luther King, but also Rosa Parks. Here she is on the bus, where she refused to sit in the back. Now, this isn't the actual picture. That's a journalist in the back. This is a stage photo for later on. But we often think of this moment of conscience when Rosa Parks says, no, I'm not going to go to the back. But it's part of the Montgomery bus strike. It's part of what happens. And, Rosa Parks was a committed individual. She wasn't just someone who all of a sudden said, oh, I'm just going to sit where I want. She knew what she was doing. It was part of this process of resisting the white supremacy and segregation in the United States. Now, I want to just spend a little moment here on the I Have a Dream speech. When Martin Luther King gives this speech in 1963, we are 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln issued in 1863. And we can talk a little bit about that in the discussion period if you like. But keep this in mind, in 1963, it's 100 years after the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. And he starts his speech. We all know this part. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident. that all men, and I just add in people, are created equal. And he goes on, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. And then he goes on, but 100 years later, 1963, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. And here's a part that we often don't hear repeated. It would be fatal, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King says, for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. And those, he's saying this in 1963, we are in 2023. And those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. And so with that and the civil rights movement in the 60s, and the legislation, we can say the culture of racism and white supremacy, it finally ended, didn't it? And the civil rights movement was successful. Yet, was it? Yet, this lost cause narrative about the Civil War continues, right? The notion of the Confederate statues all over the country being removed is erasing our history. The idea, if you would, that poverty in many of the urban areas that have large African-American populations is not a result of institutional racism, that somehow institutional racism has nothing to do with it, continues. That there are, the notion, for instance, that we can go anywhere and no one will bother us based on the color of our skin. Well, that isn't true either. The notion of driving while black. I mean, when my sons were teenagers, many years ago now, I didn't tell them anything about that. You have to be careful where you are. Remember, you can't drive in these areas because you could get stopped just by who you are. It's driving while black, and the lecture to African-American teenagers is real as you're growing up. You want to be careful not to go in these areas. You can be stopped. It's just not on teenagers. The African-American senator from South Carolina himself has talked about this, was stopped because he was driving while black. It's happened, but many instances. And so from the sort of everyday cultural level to the institutional level, in the inequities in salaries and payments based on color, to ordinances that will seek to disenfranchise you from voting. All of that continues. And alongside of course, this lost cause narrative in our popular culture that we can see with the Southern statue and the notion that somehow we're erasing our history by removing the Confederate statues and removing the Confederate names. Now, keep this in mind. The Daughters of the Confederacy and other Southern heritage groups emerge in the 1880s and 90s. And the statues, when we think of the statues of the Confederate generals and the Confederate and members of the Confederacy, they were constructed in the 1880s and 90s and the early 20th century as part of the redominance of the white supremacy classes in the United States after Reconstruction, to show the blacks that they were back and that they had better push themselves aside because, the little hopes of freedoms of the late 19th century, that's all done. We're returning. And so we really, cannot underestimate that that the Daughters of the Confederacy and the movement to create a narrative about the Civil War and a narrative about there is no racism in the United States is very, very premeditated. From the textbooks that are written to naming schools after Confederate general to normalizing what the Confederacy represented. What did the Confederacy represent? So when we see statues coming down in New Orleans, in the Great Stone Mountain in Georgia, being closed with the Confederate generals and Jefferson Davis being heralded at this huge sculpting piece on the Stone Mountain in Georgia, which is over 400 feet above the ground. In Charlottesville, when finally the statue of Lee was finally removed, and at University of North Carolina, Silent Sam, he was called, a Confederate soldier, his statue was finally removed. These statues being removed represented the Confederacy. And I don't know how much time I have. It's 8 o'clock. If I can take a few more minutes, Dana, can I have a few more?
Sure, we don't have a hard stop, so that's totally fine.
Okay. I hope if the folks don't mind me going a little over 8 o'clock, I just wanted to, I won't read through it, but I have the speech that was given at the dedication of this statue at the University of North Carolina. And it was the unveiling of this Confederate monument. And this was in June 3rd, 1913. And in this speech, and I'll just summarize what happens in this speech. It's very clear that this statue represents the resurgence of the Confederacy in the culture, not in the politics of the South. And it does so very, very significantly, really looking and calling the Southerners a superior race, essentially, and African Americans an inferior one, and that's in the dedication speech, and cleaning up the reasons that the Civil War happened, and the need to put these statues in place to herald the nobility of the Southern cause. Now, keep this in mind. What did the Confederacy represent? This is, we often seen this flag, the Confederate, one of the Confederate flags. This is really from the Northern Virginia battle flag. But anyway, we see it all over the place. This is, of course, from one of the insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol building in 2020, and the Confederate flags were everywhere, along with the Trump flags and a few U.S. flags. What did the Confederacy represent, though? It represented white supremacy. It represented slavery. It represented racism. It represented Nazism, before Nazism, didn't it? It represented the domination of the whites over everybody else. And of course, if you were Catholic or Jewish as well, in the late 19th and early 20th century, you would also find yourself excluded, and at times with a burning cross on your lawn by the KKK. The Confederate flag is the same as the Nazi flag. You cannot raise the Nazi flag in Germany. You cannot do the Sieg Heil, the Nazi salute, and it's illegal for good reason. World War II and the Holocaust. And the Confederate flag, if it was only representing fried chicken and mint juleps and sweet potato pie and other sorts of noble ways of life on the land, well, that would be different, but it doesn't. It represents slavery, and slavery is what the Nazis wanted to do. They were going to enslave the subhumans and use them as a slave economy for the superior races had they won World War II. The South already was doing that. And so if you're a person of conscience and you understand what the South represented and what the plantation system represented, the slavery system represented, you realize it is an insult and an offense to anyone of moral character, I'm going to say. It doesn't represent Southern heritage. It represents the Confederacy, which represents the evil of slavery. And remember, this just doesn't stop after the Civil Rights legislation. This is Highway 70 in North Carolina in 1971. This is Ku Klux Klan country. And it's right there for you to see, right, in the 70s. Not that bold anymore, perhaps, but there it is. Oops. And then, of course, this is from 2020. This is in Alabama at the Talladega Superspeedway. NASCAR had banned the Confederate flag, but this was this huge protest of the Confederate flag in 2020. And this is, of course, another one, Highway 40 North in North Carolina in 2020. This one's in South Carolina. And off of Highway 85. Supposedly, I had read in a news article and in a paper that this is supposed to have come down in January 2023. It was supposed to come down. I haven't checked to see if it has. And of course, this is in Lowell, Mass. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a Confederate flag on the back of this truck. I was not driving. My wife was driving, and every once in a while you'll see Confederate flags and trucks in our area here, and the Confederate flag is part of an ideology of hate that persists. It is the same as the Nazi flag, and the sooner we come to terms with that, the sooner that we realize what the Confederacy actually represented. I don't know, would you want to be carrying the Nazi flag? I don't understand what people are thinking with the Confederate flag and what they think the Confederacy represented. I have no idea. The choice is really ours. We can understand the past as it creates the present. We can value human dignity. We can recognize injustices, or really we're going to suffer from ignorance in favor of slogans and the catastrophes that have yet to come. So I suggest we move forward with understanding our past and understanding that past is not always filled with apple pie. I love apple pie, but that the past has so much in it in our country that needs to be taught. We just can't say, let's not teach critical race theory. And by the way, critical race theory is a very specific legal a set of pedagogies that have to do with lots in legal education, but not teaching about the history of racism in the United States, when the history of racism and the role of race was central to the founding of the United States, and so central it was in the Constitution with the 3/5 clause, and it has been a central part of the history of the United States, as some of these examples I've tried to show you. But it also predates the US and is part of the European experience, of course, that led to the development of fascism and Nazism in the 20th century. And that's what the Confederacy represented. But the history of racism as it continued into a segregated society that wanted to maintain segregation and maintain the mythology about the South and about the Confederacy to the present day, and not teach the truth. Well, if we don't teach what was, then we only teach mythology. And I don't know about you, it'd be better to teach history and not mythology. Thank you.
Very powerful presentation, and oh, you can't hear?
Now I can. I couldn't hear you at the beginning.
I was going to say, very powerful presentation, and certainly lots of information there. Something that struck me early on in your presentation was showing those statistics about where the slaves in the world had gone. And I
Yeah.
always, in my mind, envision the US to be the greatest recipient of them. But
No.
Brazil in Spanish empire
Yeah.
was a very strong leader. How were they utilizing slaves in their countries?
So again, you know, I did an awful lot in a short, only an hour, and I hope I didn't go too quickly, but in an attempt just to show you really this broad spectrum of our history. But from when Columbus arrives in the late 1490s, and the Spaniards, expand into the Americas, we often forget that from the late, from let's say 1492 until the 17th century, the really the 1600s, Spain was the world power of its day. Spain was one of the richest, became the richest and most powerful kingdom. And what we think of as the United States today, Florida, all the southern areas into Texas, and going right up into what we think of as Nevada and New Mexico and California, all the way down into Central America, and all the way down throughout the entirety of South America, excluding Brazil. All that New World was Spain. That was New Spain. And when the Spaniards arrive, they begin to enslave the indigenous populations, but because of the disease factor, the indigenous populations had no immunities to any of. We're just coming out of a pandemic, of course, and we understand the immunities, but they had no immunities to any to measles, to influenza, to smallpox, which was a huge scourge, and as a result, enslaving the Native Americans didn't work out because they died in huge numbers. I mean, we don't realize this, but when the Aztecs are conquered by what's his name, Cortez, they're conquered. But during that battle for Tenochtitlan, which is today Mexico City, smallpox really wipes out a huge percentage of the Aztec population. They're incredibly weakened because of smallpox. So things might have been different, but in any event, it didn't work out too well enslaving the indigenous population because many of them were dying off, but also they knew where to escape to. When they would flee, it was their territory. They knew where to go, and which wasn't the case for people who had never been here. And so the Spaniards begin to bring in the thousands upon thousands, millions by the end of it, African slaves who had immunities because they had been interacting, of course, with the European world. And in fact, the Afro-Eurasian world had been interacting for centuries upon centuries. So they had a lot of the base immunities on that level. And if they escaped it, they didn't have anywhere to go. There was no villages. There's nowhere to run to. I mean, they didn't know the terrain. So and the Spaniards, and then the British would have places like Jamaica. The British would have a variety of Caribbean islands. The French would eventually have some Caribbean islands. The Dutch would have some islands along with the Spaniards. The Portuguese would take all of Brazil as well. And the slaves would be on sugar plantations. Sugar plantations, particularly in the Caribbean, would be huge money producers. I mean, sugar is still a money producer, right? So huge money producers on the sugar plantations, sugarcane. And later on, coffee and tea, of course, production, but also mining. So New Spain will have a lot of smaller ones, but two major mines, one in Bolivia and one in Mexico, in Zacatecas in Mexico, and Potosi in Bolivia. One would be a gold mine, another a silver mine. And so they would, and Spain extracted huge amounts of gold and silver bullion, which they used. It was African slaves that did all of that work. Did I answer your question?
You did. Thank you. I had no idea that the US was not the largest leader by
No.
far.
No, because it wasn't. And the the centers of the major exporting plantations were the sugarcane. The cotton that you get from and then tobacco. Tobacco became a huge commodity, but so did cotton in the United States. But a lot of that cotton went into the northern mills. Essentially, I mean, you had some of that cotton also went into British mills, but so that was your market. But sugar and coffee and tea became huge global exports. But then the Spaniards, not to get too much into this, but the Spaniards used that silver bullion. The gold bullion they pumped into the European economy. The silver bullion became part of the Spanish galleon circuit. So Spanish galleons would come out of Seville and other Spanish ports, come into the New World. They'd pick up, the silver bullion. They would essentially, way before the canal, go around the Cape of Good, around the tip of South America, and off they would go to China. And by 1557, I think it was, Spain conquers the Philippines. And Manila is established. Manila becomes a major port for the Spanish galleons, and they didn't all go around South America. They would also go overland, and then on the Pacific side of the coast of what today is Mexico and Central America, Spanish ships would take the silver and gold. Mostly, the silver would be for China. They'd stop off and refuel in Manila, and then the silver bullion, because the Chinese, at that point, the Chinese dynasty and Chinese traders wanted silver. They wanted to be paid in silver. Silver was the currency of the Chinese empire, the Chinese dynasties. So silver was used for trade with China, and gold was used for the Spice Islands and for trade with India. And because India, of course, had the pepper coast. So the pepper came from what we call the Malabar coast on India. All the pepper would come out of that, it's the western coast of India. And the Spice Islands, of course, maritime Indonesia and that area would be the Spice Islands. Early on, the Europeans didn't realize they could export the spice plants, and then begin to, they would realize it later in the 19th century, and they'd begin producing cinnamon and cloves in Zanzibar and other places. But at this time, early on, they thought the spices only came from those islands, and so they would trade over there. But the point is, it's that silver and gold bullion, and in addition then to the sugar, became global commodities. And I'll stop there, though. I'm going on too long.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I know Cindy had a question about third to a halfway through, and I did want to make sure we acknowledge that.
Yes, please.
I know you wanted to go through your presentation. So Cindy, if you have a question or comment, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great presentation. I recently read a book called Wake by I think it was Rebecca Hall, and she talks about the hidden history of women-led slave revolts, both on slave ships and at plantation sites. Is that something that you came across in your research as well?
So this is Rebecca Hall, you said Wake?
Yes, Wake. Yeah, it's a graphic novel.
So I'm unfortunately, I'm writing it down now.
Oh, okay.
I'm not familiar with her work. I haven't read, I'm just not familiar with her work at all. But I think, when you talk about rebellions on slave ships, I didn't deal with that at all. Obviously, there was a lot in here, but that is a reality that is often overlooked. I mean, there was so I don't know about this book, but I know that men and women, if you read through some of the works of the primary works of Equiano, he was a slave who became free, and other memoirs. There was a recent work, and I can't remember it now. I'm sorry, but there it was a ship called the Diligent, I think, and a fellow historian out of Yale, I think I can't remember his name, and I'm really struggling to remember. But and also Marcus Rediker, he wrote something called the Amistad Rebellion, and they made it into a movie as well. And the movie, of course, didn't follow the reality, but that's the way it goes with movies. It was still a powerful film. But on all of these ship rebellions, men and women, all the reports participated. And we often find in some of the accounts of the different rebellions in the United States, the Nat Turner Rebellion, they were participated by men and women. Men, predominantly, but I remember reading about there was always a role that the enslaved women would play too. But I don't know. This isn't an area I know enough about. So as you can see, I'm really pulling at straws to try and create something here. But I do remember reading about this. It's not an area that I have done anything worth. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate it. And one of the things that she brought up is that in a lot of cases on the ships, men took women as being the weaker sex and being more but they also brought them on. They would take them from below deck to the upper deck to be sexually assaulted and to be used, and so they had an opportunity to be unchained, and would often take that to either start a rebellion or to jump ship. And so I thought that was interesting.
Well, it is. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, no. So thank you for that. And I wanted to make. I also really appreciated you talking about how much it's continued on today. My stepfather was in the service and went to North Carolina, where there was a giant billboard that said the KKK welcomes you.
Yeah.
And his descriptions of what it was like to be Black in the service are unbelievable. Also, I thought it was very interesting you bringing up current events, because I feel like so much, we think of it as not being a Northern issue and not being but I think there's more attention that's being brought up about that. There was a slave ship captain in Salem that was very, very wealthy, and a book just came out about him that, personally, I found it a bit dry, but it was interesting. I live on the northern town right on the New Hampshire border, and I see Confederate flags every day. Every day.
I'm just wanted to reinforce to what you're saying, but you mentioned Salem, and what we don't, Salem was a major port.
Yeah.
And a lot of those captains, a lot of those beautiful homes in Salem, that were owned by some captains, but also owned by investors in the China trade. But it wasn't just the China trade; it was also the slave trade. And that's so all the Lowell mills. Lowell is known for all of its mills in the national park. That was all slave cotton. All right, and then they produced textiles that they sold that were used on slave plantations. So we often forget that. And when you mention the military, in the 1970s, there was some studies done and some documentaries about the resurgence. This is the 1970s now. And so I had just started teaching in 1981. I just began my teaching career. And I was an undergraduate in the 70s, and then a graduate student, and I finished in graduate school in 81. So I remember, I've had an interest in this since my undergraduate years, and I won't go into all of that. We'll be here another half hour. But all I remember is there were these studies done, and I remember watching a documentary about the resurgence of hate groups in the United States, and was tracing the resurgence of neo-Nazi groups and the KKK. And one of the figures was David Duke. And David Duke would later become a member of the Louisiana state legislature. I don't remember if he actually became lieutenant governor, but he ran for lieutenant governor. He was an imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan at one point. He was a member in his younger days of a neo-Nazi group. And he was also featured in these different documentaries. But the point is, it traced several of these groups in the South and several in California. And one of the things they all were saying, these groups, again, this is going back 45 years now, is that their objective, they're small, but their objective was to grow, and was to join the armed forces and police departments, and to influence the armed forces and police departments over time by having more and more members of these neo-Nazi and KKK affiliated groups as career military and career police. Now, we know that to some extent that seems to have happened. And we again, no study has been done. I don't know how significant that is, but certainly we can see some of that. And I think that gives a lot of credibility to what you were just saying, Cindy. And it's a huge problem unless we address it, and we have to teach about it, and we have to learn about it. And I have, I'm retired now. I teach part-time at UMass Lowell, but I had 40 years of full-time career, and now just one course a semester, and I like it that way. But all too often, history is not the discipline that is encouraged, and certainly the history of this material has become a political football in many areas. And I don't understand it. I mean, do we want, I'm going to say it again, do we want to teach about what was, or we want to just make it up? And I think, if I may, editorialize for a moment here, many of your politicians, and particularly one Southern governor from one Southern state called Florida, is interfering in a major way in the higher ed down there, and saying what can be taught and can't be taught, and is trying to anyway. Yet, at some point you should allow the experts in the field to advise. Instead, they're allowing the ideology to guide. And that's very dangerous when a society allows an ideology like racism to guide, and doesn't allow real evidence to dictate what we're going to teach. It's very dangerous. It's more reminiscent of Soviet education, and now Imperial Russian education, and the education of Nazi Germany, than anything else. And I know I don't mean to be too harsh, but I am being harsh because I actually do mean it. But what am I saying? We need to teach the truth, and the truth lies in the evidence. So if we didn't have the plantations, if we didn't have the articles of succession, if we didn't have the record of brutality of women being used as breeders, being raped as a norm in not just the slave ships, but that was their role in the Southern plantations. And then we could say, oh, that never happened because it didn't happen, but it did. And there's too much evidence that indicates that it did. Okay.
Yeah. And just as a final comment, I mean, just as what you said, it's also very interesting. And then I'll stop because I feel like I could talk to you forever. That the current head of the Massachusetts chapter of the neo-Nazi group, Christopher Hood. He lives in Newburyport, Massachusetts,
Right.
which is, people think of Newburyport as such a, it's a liberal, it's an arts community. But he is aggressively right now working to pull Black history, including Black biographies, from the school systems. And so that's an active fight that's going on right now in Newburyport.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Newburyport, really?
Yep.
I'm writing it down. Because one of the things that happens in retirement is it's called forgetting now and again. Newburyport, but and that's fascinating and frightening. But you're right. What I want to say is nowhere is immune to this stuff. Celine, did you want to have a question? Did you?
No questions. We really appreciate all the history and the information. It's very interesting and sad, but it's all about learning and then spreading what we know to others.
Well, it is. I just today a book just came in in the mail by Jean Theo Harris, one of the authors there. But she wrote a wonderful biography of Rosa Parks, and it just came in, and I just started to read it before dinner, and it's really great. But we often her theme is, so we will erect statues to Martin Luther King Jr. We will as happened in 2005, I think it was, when Rosa Parks died. She was she worked for the congressional office for most of her career. I mean, her career in Detroit after she left Montgomery, in the congressional office of the U.S. Rep. Conyers, and when she died, I think she was in her early 90s. She was she lied in state in the U.S. Capitol. And it was a big ceremony about, Rosa Parks. It was very touching. And Jean Theo Harris, of course, her thesis is, so we have the statues now to Rosa Parks in the rotunda, the statues all over the place to civil rights leaders, but we have to be careful that we memorialize these figures, yet, and politicians will all come out and memorialize them. But at the same time, legislation is not in place to make the changes and continue the civil rights changes that they all were fighting for. And so anyway, this new book is trying to, well, new for me, it just came in today. She's updated it, I think, more recently. So I'll read it, but I recommend it to you. Well, it wasn't on the list. I'll put it on my list. I'll send it off to Dana. It's just a powerful piece, because we often don't realize that Rosa Parks simply wasn't this random person who was just tired one day and decided not to go to the back of the bus, and she was going to sit down. She actually was very dedicated to the civil rights movement herself, and the Howard Buffett Foundation just purchased for $4.5 million recently all her papers, and they're now on loan to the National Archives. So she wrote, she gave speeches. She was a major figure in and of herself. And this new book by Jean Theo Harris, which I'm going to read, is a testimony to that. So I just wanted to share it. Are there any other comments or questions, or anything that you wish I had said that I didn't focus more on, and then I can think more about? And maybe sometime I can. I've often thought just to do something more focused, but my sense for these kinds of these talks is that oftentimes people don't realize, and maybe I'm wrong, just how central this history of racism has been in our society. So I don't know. Well, I hope it was useful, and I thank you for taking time out of your evening. It's now 8:30. As usual, I've taken more time than was allotted. but I really appreciate some of the discussion. I don't know if Ellen had anything she wanted to add, or Dana, anything you want to add?
I'd like to defer to Ellen, but and then just ask a quick question of you
Yes.
afterwards, but I do want to make sure she gets an opportunity to ask a question.
Ellen, please.
I'm going to say she probably doesn't want to talk.
Oh,
So,
okay, that's
and
fine then.
And that's completely fine.
Yes, 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 yes.
Just quickly, I know we were taught this growing up, in that the slavery happened in the South, and the North was pretty much not a direct contributor to slavery. Can you comment on that or add a little bit more clarity to that?
Oh, no, I'll just say that's false.
Yeah.
That the North was a integral participant in the slave economy. I mean, yeah, I mean, all of so from the building of the slave ships to the buying of all the cotton and raw materials, to the selling of food items, salted meat, salted fish, and again, you know, when the Northeast becomes really at one point, I think Lowell and Paterson, New Jersey, they were major centers for textile production globally. We don't realize just how important by the late 19th century, the Industrial Revolution that kicks off in the Northeast would eventually sideline Great Britain's production, and so, but up until the Civil War, you know, when you go through many of the neighborhoods and communities that the industrial towns had all their factories, and you see all the mansions that were built by the agents or the mill owners themselves, all that money came from the textile industry, but all the raw materials came from the slave society of the South. And so to say that the North had no role, it was an integral part of the economy. And yeah, so I mean, I think that's important to realize. When you walk through, when you go to the National Park in Lowell and walk through which is great, by the way, they've done a wonderful job. I love it. And I really do. And they've now begun to talk more about this part too. And that's what's important, is that all the raw materials that came from the South, I mean, slaves produced that. It's not to be underestimated. I mean, without the slave produced cotton, these mills wouldn't have been doing anything in Lowell. I'm pointing as if they're over here, right? But anyway. Yeah.
Well, I recognize it's late, and I'm very thankful that you were so willing to give the talk and field all these questions. We'll look forward to you at the end of next month, which is essentially this month.
Oh, yes.
About the historical context of the Russia-Ukraine war.
So that's the end of this month, right?
Yeah, what is it, the 29th, I think. I can't remember.
I better make sure. I got to check. Yeah, I'll be there.
I'll be there. I'm glad you will be there.
Yeah, you know, that's the other area, the Russian studies, Ukrainian. I kept hoping the war would wind down, and of course it's not going to at all. When we were, over the last summer, but yeah, that's a whole other area entirely. It's another area. But
so I just checked while you were talking. That's the 21st of this month,
right.
March. So we'll look forward to having you again. You're a terrific speaker and chock full of information, and we appreciate you spending your night with us. So
it's great.
I'd like to say thank you to you, as well as everybody for joining, and have a nice evening, and we'll see you at the end of March.
I hope so. All right, you take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Have a nice
Dana.
evening. Good night now.
Good night.